Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're taking on a term that is, let's just say it's highly charged.
That is putting it mildly.
Yeah, and it's fundamentally confusing, deeply embedded in political debate. We're talking about the paradox of suicidal empathy. When you look at the sources we've compiled, you see this intense friction right away. This phrase, it essentially asks, at what point does kindness or generosity toward an outside group?
Become a threat to your own survival.
Exactly. So the question for us today is whether this concept, suicidal empathy, is a legitimate psychological or, sociological observation that we should take seriously.
When we're making policy.
Right. Or if it's purely a rhetorical weapon, something designed to fuel fear and justify exclusion. That's our mission today, to figure out what we're really wrestling with here.
And that differentiation matters. It matters profoundly. Because if we accept that generosity can be weaponized like that as a political tool, then we have to approach every debate differently. The way the sources define it, suicidal empathy, is the critique that a group's compassion for an outgroup
An outgroup, yeah.
supposedly leads directly to the harm or even the destruction of their own in-group.
So it's labeling virtue as a fatal flaw.
Precisely.
It's just such a heavy accusation, isn't it?
Yeah.
That showing moral character or even just basic human decency is somehow self-inflicted harm.
Okay, let's unpack this tension immediately. Let's look at the sources that view this phrase with, well, maximum skepticism.
The ones who say this isn't a policy critique at all.
No, it's a classic political power move.
And that's really the starting point for a lot of sociologists and historians.
Yeah.
They argue that this whole suicidal empathy narrative is primarily a rhetorical device, a classic one, refined over centuries, that's designed to make things like xenophobia and exclusion palatable.
Palatable how?
Because it works by not asking you to hate the outgroup. It asks you to fear the consequences of your own good nature.
That's a really sharp distinction. It shifts the moral burden, so you're not the persecutor.
You're the reluctant defender. Exactly. And the sources break down how this rhetorical structure works. They identify, I think it was 3 specific mechanisms that make it so sticky.
Yes, so potent in public discourse. The first one is the most dramatic. They call it the Trojan horse narrative.
Okay, the Trojan horse.
If you can frame empathy as suicidal, you've successfully converted a positive moral feeling
Into a weapon.
into a literal existential threat. The moment compassion is defined as suicidal, then providing aid or extending rights to the others is immediately reframed.
It's letting a Trojan horse into the walls of your city,
That's the image.
which means every act of kindness is instantly tied to this idea of impending doom. It completely flips the moral script.
It does. It forces people into a choice between their physical safety and their moral identity.
And once you accept that premise, that compassion equals doom,
Persecution is instantly recast as self-defense.
you aren't being cruel.
No, you're just being prudent. You're patriotic. You're just prioritizing survival. It leverages a primal self-preservation instinct against our higher order moral reasoning.
It sounds like a remarkably effective tool for just paralyzing complex decision-making. So if the Trojan horse narrative is about generating that initial fear, what's the next step? How do the sources say they make that fear easier to stomach?
Well, that leads directly to the second mechanism, which is dehumanization.
Okay.
This narrative really relies on the premise that the outgroup isn't just different, but fundamentally, maybe eternally incompatible with your society. So if extending empathy is labeled as dangerous, a form of political suicide,
Then the logical conclusion is you have to keep your distance.
you must maintain emotional distance. You have to be cold, calculating, maybe even actively hostile to stay safe.
So by labeling the act of feeling empathy as dangerous, you're inherently labeling the recipient of that empathy as dangerous too.
Yes, it builds this permanent, non-negotiable wall between us and them. It makes dialogue or integration seem impossible.
And that must feed into the third component, which I remember was this idea of zero-sum thinking.
Yes, that limiting concept. The rhetoric thrives on this unquestioned assumption that resources, rights, safety. It's all a finite pie.
The idea that if the others gain a slice of that safety, then the in-group must, by definition, be losing theirs.
Precisely. It just eliminates the possibility that the pie could grow or that solutions could lead to mutual safety.
Or mutual prosperity.
The rhetoric forces a binary choice. Their survival or ours. And this is especially potent in times of economic instability, right?
Of course.
It allows cynical leaders to blame social problems on the generosity of their own citizens rather than on, say, systemic failures.
Okay, so we've established that this phrase can be a profoundly powerful political weapon. It's designed to short-circuit rationality and replace it with fear, but, it would be intellectually dishonest to assume this term is only a cynical tool.
It would be.
We have this whole counter set of sources, thinkers, academics who argue that suicidal empathy actually points to a legitimate critique, a critique of what they call pathological altruism.
Right. Let's switch gears and look at that.
Yeah, the academics who argue this phrase points to a very real policy failing.
This counterview treats the concept less as a political smear and more as a genuine warning. A warning about the dangers of flawed policy design that's driven solely by emotional reaction. Their core distinction is simple, but it's profound.
And that is?
Empathy is an emotional impulse. It is not a policy framework.
So if I'm reading the sources right, the critique isn't about being compassionate. It's about failing to scale that compassion past an individual story.
That's a perfect summary.
So it's basically arguing that a policy can be driven by the purest intent, morally perfect even, but be practically disastrous.
Right.
Is that pathological altruism?
That's it in a nutshell. Pathological altruism describes the problem of acting solely on that immediate, intense emotional pull of a victim's story.
The suffering right in front of you.
Exactly. Without doing the due diligence on the long-term logistical or security outcomes. The critique is that this kind of narrow, emotionally driven decision might inadvertently cause greater harm to everyone down the line.
Including the very people you intended to help.
Yes. It's unintended consequences born of emotional urgency, not strategic planning.
And the main consequence they focus on, the primary policy failure they cite, is what they label in-group neglect.
Absolutely. And they see this as the empirical evidence of suicidal empathy in action.
How so?
The argument is built on this concept of primary moral duty. Proponents of this view say that leaders, governments, have a foundational duty to ensure the stability and safety of their own community first.
It's that classic analogy, right? The oxygen mask on a plane.
Put your own on first.
You have to secure your own mask before you could effectively help anyone else.
Precisely. So they see policies that prioritize the suffering of an outgroup, especially if the resources used jeopardize domestic stability, as a betrayal of that foundational duty.
And they categorize this not as real compassion, but as
Virtue signaling. The criticism is that the policy seems designed less to solve a complex problem sustainably and more to make the policymaker feel morally superior.
which is a poor foundation for governance.
A very poor foundation.
So on one side, we have political cynics using suicidal empathy to justify exclusion. On the other, policy critics using it to demand rational governance, arguing against these emotionally driven decisions. The tension here is that sometimes both groups use very similar language.
And that leads us perfectly to the middle ground that several behavioral economists and psychologists have found. They argue that the problem isn't the feeling of empathy itself.
Which is a wonderful human trait.
Of course. The problem is the narrowness of how we apply it in large-scale decision-making.
Okay, so this is where we get into the work of thinkers like Paul Bloom.
Exactly, author of Against Empathy.
He forces us to really define what we even mean by empathy when we're talking about millions of people.
He does. Bloom argues we need to shift the focus from the supposed danger of feeling compassion to the very real danger of misapplying it. And he uses this fantastic analogy. Empathy is like a spotlight.
A spotlight.
It focuses intensely, powerfully on one specific person or one identifiable group. It highlights their pain, their immediate needs.
And the power of a spotlight is that it leaves everyone else standing in the shadows.
Precisely. The people in the shadows who might have greater but less visible or less dramatic needs are entirely in the dark of our emotional attention.
Which is why news coverage is so potent. You focus on one devastating story, and that specific suffering becomes the emotional driver for the entire policy debate.
Even if the broader data points somewhere else entirely.
That immediately clarifies the policy failure then. If you're hyper-focused on the person under the emotional spotlight, you naturally ignore the consequences for everyone else.
For the broader systems, for everyone in the shadows who might rely on those systems functioning correctly.
And the sources highlight the painful consequence of this. When we use raw spotlight-style empathy to favor one group, we can inadvertently end up being cruel to another group by default.
The intention was altruistic, to alleviate suffering, but the outcome is damaging because the perspective was just too limited.
So we can't rely on raw empathy because it's a poor tool at scale. And we certainly can't rely on cynical fear-mongering. Which brings us to the crucial alternative proposed in the sources, rational compassion.
Right. Rational compassion is the framework proposed to address these failures. It tries to pull the best parts from both sides of the critique. It accepts that emotional input, that initial pull of concern for suffering, but insists the final decision must be filtered through facts, data, and realistic assessments of resources.
It sounds like taking the energy of empathy and then channeling it into effective governance,
That's a great way to put it.
designing solutions that are scalable and sustainable, not just emotionally satisfying in the moment.
It is about stability and scale. And most importantly, it replaces that zero-sum thinking with systems-level planning.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Instead of immediately sending every available resource based on the emotional urgency of one appeal, rational compassion ensures that the aid logistics don't deplete the domestic supply chain needed to keep the system running.
Preventing a second greater crisis down the line.
Yes. The goal shifts from immediate emotional relief to the long-term verifiable well-being of the most people possible.
That really drives home the difference between a reaction and a strategy. We've covered a lot here, defining suicidal empathy as both a weapon and a genuine critique.
And this leads us to the synthesis, the key takeaway from all this. The legitimacy of that phrase, whether it's a warning or a weapon, depends heavily, crucially, on the intent behind its usage.
The intent.
It's the intent that distinguishes a genuine policy critique from a cynical campaign designed to shut down dialogue.
And this is the critical analytical distinction that you should take away from this deep dive.
Hmm.
Let's clearly articulate the two critical intents the sources lay out.
Okay, first, if the speaker's intent is to say, we cannot help these people because they are inherently a virus, an existential threat.
And their very presence is a danger to our way of life.
Yes. That usage is almost always a precursor to persecution. It seeks to close the door permanently and justify hatred.
Got it.
And the second intent.
Second, if the intent is to say, we must find a way to help that aligns with our primary moral duty and doesn't destabilize our own ability to function,
Or deplete our resources beyond recovery.
then that is a legitimate, necessary debate about resources, logistics, and responsible, sustainable policy. It seeks to solve the problem, not just eliminate the beneficiaries.
It's a huge difference.
A world of difference. And this raises an important question for you to consider as you navigate these debates in the future. When you analyze a public policy discussion, whether it's on foreign aid or internal resources or extending rights, what specific language cues do you listen for? How do you distinguish in real time between an appeal for rational policy and a rhetorical attempt to justify exclusion? That's the critical lens we encourage you to mull over after this deep dive.